It all began on the edge of a quiet little town in Colorado, where the mountains press close against the sky, and wild animals are never too far from someone's backyard. One morning, a neighbor spotted something that seemed almost impossible. A fluffy orange house cat carrying a bobcat kitten gently by the scruff of its neck. The tiny wild cub looked so out of place in her careful jaws, yet she treated it as if it were her own child. And here's the haunting question that caught everyone's breath. Could a mother's love really cross the line between domestic life and the wild? You probably won't believe what happened at the end of this story, but I promise you it will melt your heart. So before you get into this unbelievable story, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like the story I'm telling. The story begins on a cool spring morning in the foothills of Colorado, where the air smells faintly of pine and the grass is still wet with dew. A farmer stepping out onto his porch first noticed the unusual sight. A plump, fluffy orange cat trotting proudly across the yard, a tiny bundle swinging from her mouth. At first, he assumed it was one of her newborn kittens, but when he looked closer, his heart skipped. The kitten's ears were too pointed, its spots too pronounced, its little body longer and leaner than a house cat's. It was not a kitten from her litter. It was a wild bobcat cub. How it ended up abandoned on the edge of the property, no one knew. Maybe its mother had been struck by a car. Maybe she had moved the rest of her litter and this one had been left behind. All that remained certain was that the cub had little chance of survival on its own. And yet, here was the orange cat carrying it as though it were the most natural thing in the world. When she reached her corner of the porch, she set the cub down beside her own kittens. She curled her body protectively around them all, licking each head in turn, smoothing fur with her rasping tongue. To everyone's surprise, the bobcat cub was not pushed away. It was embraced. She pressed its small head to her belly, offering milk. For a moment, the tiny wild creature resisted, confused by the strange scent, but hunger won. Soon it suckled alongside her own kittens, and in that moment it became part of her family. Neighbors began to talk. People gathered at the fence to peek in. It seemed impossible, a domestic cat taking in a wild predator as if it were her child. Yet day after day, the orange cat proved her commitment. She groomed the bobcat more vigorously than the others, licking behind its ears, cleaning the dust from its spotted coat. She batted at its paws playfully, teaching it how to wrestle, how to stalk in miniature steps across the porch. At night she slept curled around it, a golden halo of fur wrapped around a wild heart. There was one unusual moment that made everyone gasp. One of her kittens, smaller and more timid, squeaked and stumbled during play. The bobcat cub, though only weeks old, reacted with a sharp, wild hiss, startling the others. For a heartbeat, it seemed nature was already showing its teeth. But the orange cat intervened instantly, swatting the bobcat gently on the nose before pulling it back into her arms. The cub quieted, looking up at her with wide eyes. Somehow her presence seemed to tame the outburst, as though reminding it of the boundaries of family. The local veterinarian, when called to examine the situation, shook his head in disbelief. "It shouldn't be possible," he murmured. "But she believes it's hers, and sometimes belief is stronger than instinct." He recommended keeping a close watch, yet even he couldn't deny the warmth of the sight. The domestic mother cat raising a creature that should have been her enemy. One afternoon, a thunderstorm swept through the valley. Rain pounded the roof, and lightning cracked across the hills. The farmer thought the animals would scatter in fear. Instead, he saw the orange cat crouched in the barn, her body spread like a shield over her brood. The bobcat cub nestled beneath her chest, trembling but comforted by her warmth. That night, no matter how loud the storm roared, she refused to move. Her eyes remained open, watchful, guarding the creature she had claimed as her own. By now, everyone in the town knew of the story.
Some called it a miracle, others a mistake waiting to turn dangerous. But no one could deny the simple, powerful image. A tiny orange house cat defying nature itself, insisting that love was bigger than species, bigger than fear. Still, a question lingered in the air. As the bobcat grew larger, as its wild instincts sharpened with every passing day, what would happen when love and nature collided? By midsummer, the gentle miracle that had charmed the neighborhood began to take on a darker edge. The bobcat kitten, once so small and clumsy, was now stretching into long, lean muscle. Its spotted coat gleamed in the sunlight, its tufted ears twitched at every sound, and its eyes burned with a wild intensity that no domestic animal could match. Side by side, the difference between it and the house cat's litter was undeniable. The orange cat's kittens still mewed playfully, rolling over one another in harmless games. But the bobcat no longer played in the same way. It crouched low, tail twitching, before pouncing with surprising force. One afternoon, it leapt at a fluttering bird that had landed near the porch, catching its wing in a blur of claws. The neighbors who witnessed it fell silent. There was no mistaking it now. This was no house cat in disguise. Fear spread quietly among those who had admired the bond. "It's only a matter of time," someone whispered. "That animal will turn." The farmer's wife began closing the barn doors at night, afraid that the growing cub might hurt the family's chickens. Even the children, once eager to peek through the fence, now kept their distance. The word dangerous hung heavily in the air. Yet through it all, the orange cat refused to abandon her unusual child. Each time the bobcat hissed or struck too hard in play, she was there in an instant, swatting him lightly, pulling him close with firm licks across the head. When the cub crouched to stalk the smaller kittens, she darted between them, her back arched, her protective fury plain. It was as though she was telling him over and over, "You are loved, but you must learn to belong." One unforgettable moment came during a routine visit from the veterinarian. The man knelt carefully near the cub, hoping to check its growth, but the bobcat bristled, lips curling, a low growl rumbling in its chest. For a tense second, it seemed the cub might strike. Then, astonishingly, the orange cat stepped forward. She pressed her small body against the wild youngster, rubbing her cheek against his until the growl faded into silence. The vet exhaled with relief. "I've never seen anything like it," he admitted. "Her presence is the only thing keeping him calm." But there were close calls. One evening, the farmer's dog, a curious border collie, wandered too near the porch. The bobcat, larger now, lunged with startling speed, claws outstretched. The dog yelped, scrambling back in shock. The humans shouted, rushing to pull the cub away. For an instant, the fragile peace seemed shattered. Yet once again, the orange cat was there, inserting herself between predator and prey, her body pressed firmly against the cub's chest. She would not allow him to cross the line, even when instinct demanded it. Still, everyone wondered, how long could this last? Every day the bobcat's power grew. Its paws, once the size of marbles, now left impressions in the dirt like small stones. Its playful nips became sharper, its leaps higher, its gaze more piercing. Neighbors urged the farmer to call wildlife officials to separate the animals before it was too late. But each time he hesitated. He would look out at the porch where the orange cat licked the bobcat's ears as tenderly as any mother, and his resolve would waver. "Not yet," he whispered. "Not while she still believes."
The climax of that summer arrived on a late afternoon when the bobcat, driven by instinct, chased a rabbit across the yard. It caught the creature beneath its paws, pinning it down with a ferocity that startled everyone watching.
The orange cat rushed forward, her eyes blazing, and hissed with a sound no one had ever heard from her before. Incredibly, the cub released the rabbit, stepping back in confusion. Then, as though chastened, it pressed its head against her side, seeking reassurance. In that moment, the message was clear. Love had not erased the wild, but it had shaped it, softened its edge, and reminded the young predator of the bond that had raised it. By autumn, the bobcat was nearly unrecognizable from the fragile cub first carried in the orange cat's jaws. Its shoulders rippled with muscle, its paws were broad and powerful, and its movements carried the unmistakable grace of a predator. The contrast between the enormous wildcat and the tiny mother who had raised it was almost surreal. The family knew the time had come. Wildlife officers had visited more than once, urging them to think of safety. The farmer had resisted for months, torn between fear and wonder. But finally, he agreed. A place had been arranged at a sanctuary in the Colorado mountains, a protected reserve where bobcats could roam free. The day of separation was one of the hardest the household had ever known. Officers arrived with carriers and gloves, prepared for a struggle. The bobcat bristled at their approach, growling, its tufted ears pressed flat in defiance. But then, as if sensing her child's fear, the orange cat stepped forward. She pressed her small body against the young bobcat's chest, purring steadily. The wild cat trembled, but allowed itself to be guided. It climbed into the carrier without resistance, eyes locked on the little orange figure that had been its mother since birth. The porch felt empty after that. The orange cat paced restlessly, her eyes lingering on the yard as though waiting for a child who would never return. Neighbors assumed the story was over, that eventually the mother cat would forget and the bobcat would vanish into the wilderness forever. But life had one more surprise in store. Weeks later, on a quiet evening, the farmer's wife heard a strange sound outside, a deep, throaty chirrup that sent a chill down her spine. She stepped onto the porch and froze. At the edge of the yard stood the bobcat, no longer a cub, but a magnificent young adult. Its coat shone, its muscles rippled, its wildness was undeniable. And yet, as it stepped closer, its massive head dipped low, and it released a soft, almost kitten-like cry. The orange cat, who had been dozing by the door, bolted upright. For a heartbeat, everyone feared what might happen. But then, with no hesitation, she bounded forward. Against all odds, the wild predator lowered itself to the ground, rubbing its enormous head against the tiny body of the cat that had raised it. The sight left the farmer and his wife speechless, tears welling in their eyes. It became a pattern. From time to time, the bobcat returned, always briefly, always gently. It never stayed long. It had its own wildlife now, its own hunting grounds, but each visit carried the same message. The bond had not broken. The cub had not forgotten. The climax of their story came one snowy evening. The family watched through the window as the orange cat and the bobcat sat together on the porch, their bodies pressed close, steam rising from their fur in the cold. For a moment, predator and pet, wild and domestic, were indistinguishable. There was no fear, no tension, only the quiet miracle of love defying nature itself. And so the story closed not with tragedy, as many feared, but with a message that still lingers in the hearts of everyone who witnessed it. Love can cross species boundaries and even the wildest of instincts. Sometimes the smallest acts of acceptance create the greatest miracles. And that, dear listener, is how a fluffy orange house cat raised a wild bobcat kitten as her own. What began as a fragile mistake grew into an unshakable bond that even time and distance could not erase. Picture them now, the little mother and her giant child pressing close in the quiet snow, proving that love does not recognize limits. If you saw an abandoned wild cub in your yard, would you have the courage to care for it? Or would you turn away, fearing what might come? Thank you for listening to the whole story. Tell me what you think by commenting below.